You shouldn't be out here alone, Brian said firmly, his voice low as rain poured onto his shoulders and soaked through the thin fabric of his work jacket. This isn't a safe place to be standing around at 2 a.m. The girl turned, abruptly, startled. Her soaked blonde hair clung to her pale face, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She glanced around quickly, as if expecting someone, or hiding from them. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her chest. I don't need your pity, she snapped, trying to sound defiant, but her voice cracked slightly. Brian stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. He was still in his city sanitation uniform, reflective stripes glowing faintly under the street lamp. I'm not offering pity, he said calmly. I'm offering a warm place, with running water, and no strangers holding knives. She hesitated. Her lips quivered, not just from the cold, and her fingers trembled as her eyes darted toward the dark end of the street. What happened? Brian asked, his tone softening. She looked down. I got robbed. Phone's dead. Bag's gone. Brian. Let the silence sit for a second before exhaling. Do you want to call someone? She shook her head quickly. No, I don't want to talk to anyone. I just need a safe place until morning. Brian hesitated. He had a 6-year-old daughter at home, no room for risks. But something about the way this girl stood there, shivering, stubborn, terrified, told him she wasn't a threat. She was, just lost. All right, he said, shifting the strap on his work bag. I live 2 blocks away. It's not fancy, but it's warm. You can take the couch. She looked like she wanted to argue again, but her knees gave slightly under her. She caught herself. Okay, she whispered. They walked side by side in silence. Brian kept a step behind, always aware, watchful. When they reached his small duplex, he unlocked the door and held it open. Inside, the place was dimly lit, lived in but clean. A child's backpack sat near the door, toys neatly tucked in a corner, a shelf lined with picture books, shoes off. There, Brian said, pointing to the mat. Couch is yours, extra blankets in the hall closet. She nodded and wiped her wet cheeks with her sleeve. Brian walked toward the back of the house into a small storage room. He placed his wallet and keys in a locked drawer, not because he didn't trust her, but because that's just how life had taught him to move. He returned with a blanket, a clean towel, and a dry sweatshirt. Bathroom's to the right, he said, handing them to her. Shower's hot, just give it a minute. She took the bundle, her eyes flicking to his face. There was confusion in her expression. He hadn't asked who she was, hadn't judged, hadn't pried. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. Because you look like someone who needs a hand. And if my daughter were ever in trouble, I'd want someone to do the same. At the word daughter, she seemed to flinch but said nothing. While she showered, Brian scribbled a short note and set it beside a steaming mug of hot water in the microwave. Then, as quietly as possible, he disappeared into the bedroom he shared with his little girl. Sophie stepped out of the bathroom 20 minutes later, wrapped in the oversized sweatshirt. The house was quiet. On the coffee table beside the sofa sat the folded blanket, the warm mug, and the note. If you need to call anyone, the landline is on the wall. Feel free to grab more blankets. Please keep the door closed. My daughter's a light sleeper. Her fingers lingered on the mug, absorbing the warmth through the ceramic. For the first time in days, she felt something steady beneath her fear. Safety. She curled up on the couch, pulled the blanket around her, and listened to the sound of rain softening outside. The man who had let her in hadn't asked for anything. Not even her name. And somehow that made all the difference. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do. But for tonight, she would sleep. Sophie woke to the sound of giggles, light, high-pitched, and unmistakably from a child. For a moment, she lay still, unsure where she was. Then the softness of the blanket around her, the scent of toast in the air, and the low hum of cartoons on TV brought the memories rushing back. Across the small living room, a little girl with curly golden hair sat cross-legged on the carpet, stacking brightly colored blocks. Her laugh bubbled again as she knocked them over, completely absorbed in her game. Sophie sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Good morning," she said gently, her voice still rough. The girl looked up at once. Her big blue eyes lit up with curiosity. "Hi," she said brightly. "You're the princess that slept on our couch." Sophie blinked. "Excuse me?" "My name's Ava," the girl said proudly. "Daddy said a nice lady stayed over because she was cold and rained." That's you." Sophie couldn't help but chuckle. It was the first real laugh she'd had in days. "I guess that's me then." "Nice to meet you, Ava," a voice called from the kitchen, casual and teasing. "Ava, breakfast duty. Come help me burn the toast." The little girl giggled and ran toward the kitchen. Sophie stretched, her body sore from the awkward position she had slept in. She followed the smell of breakfast and found herself in a small kitchen where Brian was cracking eggs into a bowl with one hand while flipping toast with the other. "You cook?" she asked, unsure whether it was surprise or admiration in her voice. Brian looked up and smiled. "Only if Ava's brave enough to eat it. You want to help?" Sophie hesitated. "I can try, but I should warn you, I'm not very domestic." He handed her a whisk. "Neither am I. That's why we go through a lot of toast around here." Together, they moved around the cramped space. Ava climbed onto a stool to butter slices of bread while Sophie tried to keep the scrambled eggs from burning. Of course, her grip on the spatula slipped and the bowl tilted, sending a sloppy cascade of eggs onto the counter and floor. "Oh no," Sophie gasped, reaching for a towel. Ava was faster. She handed her a paper towel with a grin. "It's okay. Daddy spills stuff all the time." Sophie stared at her, then burst out laughing. A genuine, light-hearted laugh that surprised even her. Brian didn't say a word. He just smiled and kept stirring the eggs like nothing had happened. When they finally sat down to eat, Sophie glanced at the slightly overcooked eggs and chewy bacon on Brian's plate. Her stomach tightened. "I'm sorry, it's not exactly gourmet," she said. Brian took a bite, chewing with dramatic seriousness. "This is great," he said, totally deadpan. "You don't have to lie," she replied, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not lying. It's edible. That counts." Ava poked at her plate and chewed with the seriousness of a food critic. Sophie tried not to watch too closely. After the meal, Brian stood up and began clearing the dishes. "You two relax. I'll take care of this." Sophie offered to help, but he waved her off. As she followed Ava back to the living room, Sophie glanced over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of Brian sneaking a plate from the oven. Fresh eggs and toast. He had made another meal. For Ava, he hadn't wanted to hurt her feelings. Later, while they built a Lego house together, Ava leaned in and whispered, "The eggs Daddy made after were better. But it's okay. He still ate yours." Sophie blinked. "He made more?" Ava nodded. "But he told me not to tell." "Oops." Sophie got up, walked to the kitchen, and leaned against the doorway. Brian looked up mid-bite, caught in the act. She crossed her arms. "So, I burned breakfast." He smiled, sheepish. "You cooked breakfast. That's what matters. Why not just say it?" He shrugged. "First time doing anything's usually messy. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing. You just need someone willing to eat the eggs." She stared at him for a moment, and something quiet and unspoken shifted inside her. This man wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress. He just showed up, with honesty, warmth, and a calm that made her feel safe. "You said something last night," she said slowly, "about hoping someone would help your daughter someday." Brian met her gaze, his voice gentle. "I meant it." "You're a good father," she said, and meant it more than she expected. He didn't answer, just smiled slightly and turned back to the dishes. Later that morning, Brian stood in the kitchen, drying his hands as Ava and Sophie sat on the living room rug surrounded by a pile of Lego bricks. Ava was determined to build a castle, and Sophie, still groggy from a restless night, was doing her best to keep up. "You sure you don't want to rest more?" Brian asked gently, leaning in the doorway. "I'm okay," Sophie replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Besides, she made me royal architect. Apparently I don't get breaks." Ava grinned. "Princesses have to work, too." Brian laughed. "She's got a point." Sophie glanced toward him. Do you always work nights? He nodded. Sanitation department. Graveyard shifts mostly. I come home in time to get Ava ready for school, then sleep a few hours. It's a rhythm. Sophie didn't say anything. At first, just watched Ava push a Lego wall into place. It's not much of a rhythm when you barely sleep. Brian shrugged. You do what you have to. After a quiet moment, he added, There's a laundromat a block away. The owner's a friend. If you're staying in the city for a bit, I can ask if they need help. Sophie hesitated. Her face grew tense for a second. I might need a job, actually. I lost everything when I got robbed. Phone, ID, even my school stuff. You're a student? He asked. I was, she said quietly. Out of state. It's complicated. Brian didn't push. He simply nodded. Let me know if you want to check it out. I'll walk you over. That afternoon, while Ava took a nap curled up with her stuffed bear, Sophie stood by the front window staring out at the gray street. The rain had finally stopped. Brian came up beside her. You good? I don't know, she said. Everything's blurry right now. I feel like I'm floating between two lives, one that's gone and one that hasn't started yet. He nodded slowly. Well, you're welcome to float here. A while. Just no floating too close to the stove. I burn eggs when I'm distracted. Sophie laughed softly. Noted. They stood there in silence for a moment. No questions, no judgments, just a kind of stillness that felt rare and necessary. That evening, Sophie helped Ava with a puzzle while Brian packed a small bag for his shift. Before heading out, he paused at the front door and looked back. Make sure she brushes her teeth, he said teasingly. Sophie gave a mock salute. Yes, sir. He smiled, and for the briefest second, Sophie saw something in his eyes. Something soft, unsaid. Then the door closed behind him. Later that night, after Ava had been tucked into bed and the house had gone still, Sophie sat alone, on the couch wrapped in the same oversized sweatshirt. She stared at the quiet walls, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the pink backpack by the door. There was no luxury here. No sparkling chandeliers or sweeping staircases like the ones she grew up around, but there was peace, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel alone. The next morning, after Brian had returned from his night shift and Ava was dropped off at school, Sophie found herself standing outside a faded yellow storefront with a flickering sign that read, Bright Spin Laundry. The inside smelled of detergent, metal, and something oddly sour. A woman with a bun so tight it looked painful glanced up from behind the counter. She wore an apron streaked with bleach stains and didn't smile. You Brian's friend? She asked. Sophie nodded. Without another word, the woman tossed her a gray apron. Clock starts now. And that was it. Sophie was in. By noon, her hands were raw from the constant dunking into hot soapy water. She had folded more towels than she could count, and her back ached from leaning over folding tables. One customer yelled at her for putting whites and darks too close together. Another shoved 3 damp bags at her and muttered, Have these done by 5, before walking out. At 2:30, she glanced at the clock and nearly groaned. Still hours to go. At 4:45, she was outside in the alley behind the shop, slumped against the wall. Her apron was stained, her arms sore, and her hair damp with sweat. Her dead phone sat useless in her pocket. She stared at the dumpster across from her and considered walking. Just leaving. Disappearing again. But when she got back to Brian's house, she said nothing. She walked in quietly, dropped her bag by the couch, and bent down to take off her shoes, wincing at the fresh blisters forming on her heels. Brian was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through Ava's school papers. He looked up and noticed her limp, but didn't comment. The next morning, Sophie found a pair of white sneakers sitting by the front door. They were brand new. Not expensive, but sturdy. Her exact size. Tucked inside one of them was a small folded note. Figured your feet deserved better. If you're walking away, at least don't walk in pain. Sophie stared at the shoes for a long time. Then she sat on the edge of the couch, slipped them on, and laced them tightly. She didn't walk away. When Brian got home that afternoon, she was in the kitchen, halfway through making toast. "You didn't leave," he said, surprised. "I almost did," she replied, not looking up. "But your guilt trip sneakers worked." He chuckled. "They weren't meant to guilt you." "No," she said, raising an eyebrow. "They were meant to say, you have a choice. That's all." Later that week, after another long shift folding, what felt like an endless mountain of towels, Sophie flopped onto the couch and groaned. "I've never been this exhausted," she muttered, rubbing her neck. "I used to think hot yoga was tough." Brian looked up from the laundry bag he was sorting. "You're earning something real now." "You mean back pain?" "I mean the freedom of living by your own hands," he replied. "Even if they get dirty, it's yours. No one can take that from you." Sophie didn't answer right away, but those words, they stuck with her, because deep down, she knew. This pain felt better than any comfort she had known before. That. Friday evening, the laundromat received a last-minute order, linens and uniforms for a local hotel. Over 100 items needed to be washed, dried, and folded by morning. Brian rolled up his sleeves without complaint. Sophie stayed behind to help. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they worked side by side. Brian folded with calm precision, his movements efficient and practiced. Sophie, however, kept unfolding and refolding the same shirt over and over, trying to match his rhythm. By 2 a.m., her fingers felt like jelly. "I can't feel my hands," she groaned, sitting on the edge of the folding table. "You'll miss them when they're gone," Brian replied dryly. They loaded the last clean bundles into the back of his old pickup. The night was cold and quiet as they drove through the sleepy streets, delivering laundry to a few private homes. At one stop, Brian handed Sophie a small bag. "Number 15, the house with the porch light." Sophie nodded and stepped out. She set the bag down gently on the stoop and turned to leave. But the porch light suddenly flicked off, and before she could react, a huge dog shot out from behind the side gate, barking violently and charging straight at her. Sophie screamed, stumbled backward, and twisted her ankle on the curb. She hit the pavement hard, scraping both palms. The truck door slammed behind her. Brian was already running. He reached her just as the dog stopped short, still barking wildly. "Back!" Brian shouted, stepping in front of her, arms outstretched. The dog hesitated, then retreated toward the yard. Brian turned, dropped to one knee, and scooped Sophie into his arms. "I told you to wait in the truck," he said, voice tight with adrenaline. "I thought I could handle a bag of laundry," she muttered, clutching her wrist. Back at the truck, he set her down in the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her. "Damn it, Sophie," he growled, dragging a hand down his face. "It's just a scrape." "I don't care about the scrape," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I care that you could have been seriously hurt. What were you thinking?" She blinked at him. It was the first time she'd seen him truly angry. But beneath the anger, there was something else. Fear. Her lips trembled. And then, to her own surprise, her eyes filled with tears. Not from pain, but from something deeper. Something she hadn't felt in years. "No one's ever yelled at me because they were scared for me," she whispered. Brian's shoulders dropped, the tension slowly easing. He sat back against the door, breathing heavily. "Well," he said, much quieter now, "you're in the wrong house then." Sophie laughed through her tears, a broken wet sound. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like a home. Sophie was folding towels behind the laundromat's front counter when it happened. A small sapphire necklace, thin, gold chain, elegant and unmistakable, slipped out from between a pair of warm sheets. It landed softly on top of the stack in front of her, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She froze. She hadn't meant to bring it here. She had hidden it deep in her duffel bag, wrapped in a sock. It must have slipped into the laundry without her noticing. Before she could move, Brian walked past. He stopped. His eyes landed on the necklace, then on her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, "That's not something a broke student carries around." Sophie swallowed hard. Her fingers moved quickly, tucking the necklace into her back pocket. I forgot it was in there, she murmured. Brian didn't move. Who is it from? She didn't answer. He stepped back, his face tightening. Who are you, really? Sophie's heart pounded. Her hands shook slightly. I'm someone who walked away from a world where everything had a price except love, she said at last. That's all you need to know. His voice dropped lower. You lied to me. I didn't lie, I just left things out. That's the same thing, Brian said, his voice flat. Sophie turned away, blinking fast, willing the tears to stop. Do you know what it's like to be watched every moment of your life? To be told who to love, what to become, where to go? No, Brian said. But I know what it's like to trust someone who doesn't trust you back. The laundromat was suddenly full of silence, the kind of silence that said more than shouting ever could. Sophie felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. Neither did Brian. They both stood there, surrounded by humming machines, the scent of detergent, and the weight of everything that had just changed. Then the front door creaked open. A man in a leather jacket stepped inside, ball cap low, phone in hand, his eyes locked on Sophie. There she is, he muttered. He raised his phone and snapped a photo. Sophie's breath caught. You've been missing 5 days, sweetheart, he said. Your daddy's offering 6. Figures to find out where you're hiding. Brian stepped forward fast. Hey, get out of here. Relax, man. I'm just doing my job, the man said, lifting the phone again. Sophie backed away, panic rising. Brian grabbed her arm. Go, he said firmly. They ran out the back. Sophie's mind was spinning. Brian didn't stop until they reached the truck. His keys were already out. He was scanning the street. What about Ava? Sophie gasped. She's at school. I'll get her. And within an hour, he did. Ava sat sleepily in the back seat, hugging a juice box while Brian drove with a quiet focus. Sophie sat beside him, still catching her breath, shaken but silent. Instead of going home, Brian turned onto a side street and pulled up in front of the neighbor's house. She'll keep Ava safe, he said. Sophie looked at him, unsure. You trust her? With my life, he replied without hesitation. Before they even knocked, Mrs. Green opened the door. Elderly and sharp-eyed, she took one look at the scene and nodded. Come in, sweetheart, she said, holding out her arms. For Ava. Brian crouched to Ava's level. You're gonna stay with Grandma Green for a bit, okay? Like a sleepover. Ava yawned. Okay, Daddy. He kissed her forehead, stood, and turned back to Sophie. Let's go. They drove in silence, heading out of the neighborhood, past the rows of quiet houses. The tension hung heavy between them. Sophie finally noticed the rip in Brian's shirt sleeve and the forming bruise on his arm. Your arm, she said, alarmed. What happened? He glanced down. That guy shoved me when I blocked his camera. Why didn't you say anything? He shrugged. As long as you and Ava are safe, I can deal with a bruise. Sophie stared at him. There it was again, that quiet strength, that instinct to protect, no matter the cost. They reached the street where the house stood, but Brian didn't park in the driveway. He slowed, scanned the block carefully, then parked a little farther away. The porch light was off. Something felt wrong. Wait here, he said. But Sophie was already stepping out. If someone's here for me, I have to face it. They walked together toward the house, and then they saw it. A sleek black town car sat parked at the curb. 2 men in dark suits flanked the porch. The front door stood open. Brian moved instinctively, stepping in front of her as a third figure emerged from the house. Tall, silver hair, impeccable suit, a presence that filled the space like thunderclouds. Emma, he said coldly. Get in the car. Sophie froze. Her breath hitched. Brian, she said quietly. That's my father. The man stepped forward. Charles Whitman, he said, addressing Brian. And you must be the one who's been sheltering my daughter. I'm the man who offered her a couch when she had nowhere else to go, Brian replied calmly. Charles looked around with disdain. This house, This neighborhood. You honestly think this is where she belongs? She made that choice, Brian said. Not me. You can't keep her here, Charles warned. I'm not keeping anyone, but I'm not handing her over like a briefcase either. Charles's eyes narrowed. You don't know who she is. I don't care who she is, Brian shot back. I know the kind of person she is. That's what matters. Sophie stepped forward, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Dad, stop, you've made your point. Charles didn't blink. Get in the car. This is home, she said quietly. No, he said, firm and final. This is where you ran to, not where you belong. Brian turned to her. You don't have to go. But she was already looking at the car. Her eyes were filled with emotion. I think I do. No one's forcing you, Brian said. Yes, she whispered. They are. Just not with words. He understood. The pressure wasn't physical. It was the pull of a life that demanded her return. She stepped back slowly, as if afraid too. Sudden a movement would break something inside her. Brian didn't follow. One of the suited men opened the car door. Charles said nothing. His mission was done. Sophie paused at the curb, back still turned. I'm sorry, she said softly. Brian didn't reply. The door closed behind her, and the car pulled away. He stood there long after it disappeared into the night. Then he walked back into the house, closed the door, and turned off the porch light. The house felt different now. Brian moved through his days in silence. He clocked in for his night shifts like always, pushed his broom down empty city streets, and returned home just before sunrise. But he didn't hum to himself anymore. He didn't linger when Ava laughed or paused to watch cartoons with her before school. He went through the motions, packing her lunch, brushing her curls, tying her shoes, but his eyes looked dim, like a light had gone out. Ava didn't ask many questions. Only once she looked up from her cereal and asked, Is Sophie coming back? Brian had paused, spoon in hand. I don't know, he answered honestly. After that, Ava stopped humming. When she played, she started sleeping with the light on. 4 days later, the coughing started. At first, Brian thought it was a cold. Ava always caught something when the seasons changed. But by midnight, her forehead was burning. She shivered under 3 blankets, her little body trembling. Brian scooped her into his arms, his keys shaking in his hand as he bolted for the truck. The emergency room was too bright, too white. A nurse whisked Ava away to triage while Brian stood pacing, heart pounding. After what felt like forever, a woman at the front desk called his name. We need a $6,000 deposit to admit her, she said. Brian pulled out his wallet and stared down at the worn leather. He had maybe $100 to his name. Can I pay part now? He asked. I'll cover the rest in a few days. I'm sorry, hospital policy. Please, he cut in, voice cracking. She's 6 years old. Still, the woman shook her head. That's when the voice came from behind him. I've got it. Brian turned. Sophie stood in the hallway, damp from the rain. Her coat clung to her shoulders. She didn't wait for him to speak. She stepped forward, handed the receptionist her card, and said firmly, Put everything under my name, room, meds, tests, all of it. The nurse typed quickly. Do you have a relationship with the patient? Sophie looked over at Brian, then said, Yes, I do. Brian stood frozen as the nurses moved Ava to a room. An hour passed before a doctor finally came. In viral infection, nothing life-threatening, but it would take time and monitoring. Brian sat beside Ava's bed, elbows on his knees, hands shaking. Sophie slipped in quietly. She sat in the chair next to him. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his voice was hoarse. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said softly. I'm sorry, he added after a moment. You shouldn't have been dragged into all this. Sophie looked over at Ava, sleeping with a damp cloth on her forehead. You didn't drag me in, she said. I came back. Brian nodded slowly, Then, after a pause, "I know you don't owe me anything, but thank you." Sophie leaned back in the chair and stared up at the ceiling. "You told me once that everyone deserves to walk without pain," she said. "That goes for hearts too." They didn't say anything after that. They just sat there side by side, listening to the soft beeping of the machines. And for the first time in days, Brian allowed himself to breathe, not just because Ava was safe, but because Sophie was back. Sophie stood in the vast marble hallway of her father's penthouse. Polished. Floors, glass walls, and a skyline stretched out behind her like a postcard, but none of it touched her. None of it moved her. She wasn't here for the view. Charles Whitman sat at the end of a long glass dining table, reading the financial section of the newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered. "I figured you'd come back once things settled," he said flatly. "I didn't come back," Sophie replied, her voice even. "I came to talk." Charles folded the paper slowly and set it down with exaggerated calm. "You're living in denial, Sophie. Running around, playing house with a man who works 3 jobs just to keep the lights on." She didn't blink. "That man saved me." "From what?" he scoffed. "A little discomfort. You had everything, security, legacy, a future, and you threw it away." "I didn't throw it away," Sophie said, stepping closer. "I walked away. There's a difference." Charles stood from the table. "You gave it all up. For what? A shoebox apartment and a man with calloused hands?" "He's not just a man. He's a father who shows up every single day. He taught me more about strength in 3 weeks than you have in 30 years. His jaw tensed. "You're really going to choose him over everything we've built?" She held his gaze. "I'm choosing myself, my life, my voice, and yes, I'm choosing the man who lives by his hands and his heart." Charles turned away, walking toward the window. "You love him?" "I do." He exhaled sharply, like the word itself had struck him. "He can't give you anything," Sophie smiled quietly. "He gives me everything that matters." There was silence. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a drink, his hand unsteady. "I never meant to be the villain," he said almost to himself. "I know," she replied. "You just forgot how to be a person." He stared down into the glass, and something in his expression softened. "He has something I don't," he muttered. Sophie tilted her head. "You mean a daughter who loves him for who he is?" He looked up sharply. She didn't flinch. "I'm going back," she said. "To him, to that life. And this time, I'm not running. I'm walking toward it." Charles didn't move to stop her, didn't say another word. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Tell him." He paused, voice lower, almost human. "Tell him he's lucky." Sophie turned back, her face soft. "No," she said. "I'm the lucky one." And then she walked out, into the rain, into the noise, into the life that was hers. She didn't look back. It was just after sunrise when the knock came. Brian was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, Ava's Saturday favorite. He wiped his hands on a towel as he moved to the door, expecting the mailman or maybe Mrs. Green returning a dish. But when he opened it, he froze. Sophie stood there. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun. Her jacket was damp with dew. In her hand she held a small brown paper bag. "For Ava," she said softly. "Blueberry muffins. The real kind. No preservatives." Brian didn't say anything. "I'm not here to stay the night," she added, quickly, steady and clear. "I'm here to stay, if you'll have me." He searched her face. There was no doubt in her eyes, no hesitation. His voice was low. "We're not rich." Sophie stepped forward. "I've had everything, Brian. Money, travel, luxury. But I've never had a kitchen that made dinosaur pancakes. I've never had a home that felt like it loved me back." Brian's throat tightened. "This house is small." "It's enough," she said. "It's full of heart." He stared at her. Every sleepless night, every quiet ache, every unspoken hope was wrapped up in this moment. "We don't have much," he said. She stepped closer. I had everything, she repeated, softer now. Just not a family. A small voice broke the stillness behind him. Sophie? They turned to see Ava standing in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Sophie knelt down, smiling through tears. Hey, sunshine. I brought muffins. Ava ran to her and threw her arms around Sophie's neck, holding on tightly. Are you staying forever? Sophie looked up at Brian. He nodded. She turned back to Ava, her voice breaking with joy. Yeah. Kiddo, forever sounds good. 2 months later, the park buzzed with the sound of families and laughter. Dogs tugged at leashes, kids chased soccer balls, and the scent of fresh pastries drifted in the breeze. Brian's old pickup truck sat under a shady tree, its tailgate transformed into a makeshift food stand. A hand-painted sign hung proudly. From the canopy, Brian's Bites, breakfast burritos, muffins, and coffee. It had been Sophie's idea. She worked the small griddle in the back, apron tied snugly, flipping pancakes and wrapping burritos with practiced ease. Brian stood, nearby taking orders, sleeves rolled up, sleeves dusted with flour. Ava darted between customers handing out napkins and dinosaur stickers with a smile too big for her face. They didn't make a fortune, but they made enough. Enough to laugh, enough to breathe, enough to build something that belonged only to them. Sophie flipped a pancake and glanced over her shoulder. Brian was watching her. His eyes full of warmth, of wonder, he mouthed, "Thank you." She grinned. She hadn't worn a diamond necklace since. She didn't need it. She had a food stand, a little girl with curls who called her my best grown-up, and a man who once offered nothing more than a couch and a warm cup of water, but somehow gave her everything. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was surviving someone else's expectations. She was living her own story. A story of second chances, of soft mornings, of simple, stubborn love. Sometimes the richest lives aren't built on wealth. They're built on kindness, honesty, and the courage to choose love over fear. Brian hadn't had much to offer when they met. Just a couch, a sweatshirt, and a quiet dignity. And that was exactly what Sophie had needed, to find something she'd never had before. Home.